And the story today is called Mrs. Honey's Hat. And there's Mrs. Honey. There she is. Mrs. Honey had a hat. On Monday, she wore it when she took her great-grandson Peter to the park. She bought him some bubble gum and sat down on the bench with her knitting. There's the bubble gum. Peter thought, those feathers would make my arrows fly better. So he pulled the feathers off the hat, and his bubble gum stuck to the brim. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Tuesday, Mrs. Honey wore her hat to visit a friend. They sat in the garden in the shade of a tree and ate cakes. Some birds flew down to pick up the crumbs. Tweet, 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 tweet. Those cherries look good, they chirped. So they flew off with them. And one little bird left some eggs behind. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Wednesday, Mrs. Honey spent a day at the seaside. The sun shone and the water was just right for paddling. Mrs. Honey felt very happy. Afterwards, Mrs. Honey took off her hat and sat in the sun. A hermit crab thought, that shell would make a nice new home. So he scuttled away with the shell and left some seaweed behind. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. Well, her hat is certainly changing, isn't it? On Thursday, Mrs. Honey picked some dandelions to make wine. It was very hard work. She took off her hat and put it on a fence. A cow in the field saw the hat on the fence and said, what beautiful big buttercups, she mooed. So she took a mouthful and her bell fell onto Mrs. Honey's hat. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Friday, Mrs. Honey went to see an old castle. Just look at those cobwebs, exclaimed Mrs. Honey. A big black spider dropped onto her hat. Hurrah, he said. This lace will make a good strong cobweb. So he hurried away with the lace and left all his old cobwebs behind. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Saturday, Mrs. Honey took her cat to a cat show. There were all sorts of fine cats, but she hoped that hers would win first prize. Which cat do you think is Mrs. Honey's? An alley cat saw Mrs. Honey's hat through the window. Wow, wow, wow. That ribbon might help me to win a prize, he thought. So he pulled it from the hat and left some fish bones behind. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. On Sunday, Mrs. Honey went to church. Everyone seemed to be staring at her. Whatever can it be? She wondered. Perhaps it's time I bought a new hat. And after the church service, Mrs. Honey hurried home to look in the mirror. And then she noticed the bubble gum, the eggs which had now hatched into little chicks, the seaweed, the bell, and the cobwebs, and the fish bones. Goodness, she exclaimed, I've got a new hat. But she wasn't sure whether she liked it or not. What do you think?